Before Shedeur Sanders ever took a single snap as the starting quarterback of the Cleveland Browns, someone had already decided he was going to fail. Not on the field, not in the film room, not during training camp. The decision was made in newsrooms, on Twitter timelines, and in press conference rooms where reporters show up not to ask questions, but to plant seeds of doubt. And for a long time it was working. The headline said it all. Shedeur Sanders' sexist comment draws backlash, tells Cleveland reporter to go make a sandwich. That was the story. That was what Cleveland sports media decided was the most important thing happening inside that franchise. Not the quarterback competition, not the offensive system, not the development of one of the most highly touted young passers to enter that building in years. A social media comment made by his brother was treated like a 5-alarm emergency. The entire city acted like the franchise was dissolving. And that tells you everything you need to know about what's really going on in Cleveland. Because this isn't just about a headline, this isn't just about one reporter with a grudge or one bad press conference question. What's been happening to Shedeur Sanders since the moment he arrived in Cleveland is something far more calculated, far more deliberate, and far more disturbing than most people are willing to say out loud. There's a pattern here, a machine that was built to make sure this kid never gets a real shot, and it's been running in the background long before Todd Monken ever walked through the door. But something happened at that press conference that changed everything. Monkin stepped to that podium, and instead of shrinking, instead of playing politics or dodging the chaos, he completely dismantled the narrative. He didn't attack anyone by name. He didn't throw anyone under the bus. He didn't have to. What he said was so calm, so precise, and so clear that every reporter who had been working against Shedeur Sanders felt it land like a sledgehammer. So today, we're going to break down exactly what's been happening. We're going to expose the media machine that's been targeting Shedeur from day one. We're going to talk about what Kevin Stefansky allegedly left behind and why the remnants of that operation are still running. And we're going to explain why Todd Monken's press conference moment might be the most important thing that's happened for Shedeur Sanders' career and possibly for the entire future of the Cleveland Browns franchise. Let's get into it. There's a very specific kind of media story that gets written when a reporter has already decided what they want the narrative to be. It doesn't start with curiosity. It doesn't start with a genuine question. It starts with a conclusion, and then it works backwards to find any shred of information that can support it. That's exactly what happened when the Go Make a Sandwich story exploded across Cleveland sports media. Here's the actual situation. Shedeur Sanders, Shedeur's brother, made a comment on social media. That's it. A young man with an opinion posting online, the way millions of people do every single day. It wasn't made inside the facility. It wasn't made at a press conference. It wasn't part of any official Browns communication. It was one person's comment on the internet. And yet somehow this became the defining story of the week for an NFL franchise that is supposed to be running a legitimate quarterback competition. Think about how absurd that is. You've got a young quarterback grinding through one of the most scrutinized evaluation processes in recent NFL history, trying to prove himself against all the noise and pressure that comes with being Deion Sanders' son in a city that has seen nothing but heartbreak at the quarterback position for decades. And the biggest story the Cleveland media can produce is a tweet made by his brother. That alone should tell you something is off. But it gets worse, because the way that story was framed, the way it was packaged and sold to the public, was designed specifically to do one thing: attach the word controversy to the Sanders name inside that building. Every time the Sanders family name gets connected to drama, to controversy, to negativity, it becomes harder for Shedeur to be evaluated on his actual football ability. The noise drowns out the signal. And for the people who don't want Shedeur to succeed, noise is exactly what they need. Mary Kay Cabot was right in the middle of it. She's been one of the primary voices covering the Browns, and if you look at her body of work surrounding Shedeur Sanders, the pattern becomes impossible to ignore. Story after story, angle after angle, always arriving at the worst possible moment, always landing in a way that puts another dent in the armor of a kid who just wants to play football. This wasn't journalism. This was a coordinated effort to shape perception, and it was working until Todd Monken walked into that room and blew the whole operation up. Anthony Lima knew exactly what he was doing.
When he stood up at that press conference and asked Todd Monken how he plans to disassociate from the Shedeur Sanders headline, he wasn't asking a football question. He wasn't trying to understand how the coaching staff manages distractions. He was throwing a grenade into the room and waiting to see what caught fire. Lima showed up with that headline already loaded and ready to use. He brought it into a conversation that was supposed to be about a quarterback competition, a serious, legitimate football discussion about who is going to lead this franchise, and tried to drag it into the swamp of social media drama. His goal wasn't information. His goal was to force Monkin into a position where any response could be used against the Sanders family. Think about the framing of that question. He asked how Monkin could make sure that stuff doesn't bleed into what you guys are doing. On the surface, that sounds like a reasonable concern, but underneath it, the message is clear. That stuff, meaning anything connected to the Sanders name, is inherently dangerous to this football team. That the presence of Shedeur Sanders in this building is a problem that needs to be managed rather than a talent that needs to be developed. That's not journalism. That's advocacy masquerading as inquiry. And here's the thing about that kind of question. It puts the person being asked in an impossible position. If Monkin had gotten defensive, Lima would have written that the coach is sensitive about Shedeur's off-field issues. If Monkin had dismissed the question, Lima would have written that the coaching staff is ignoring legitimate concerns. Either way, the story was already written before the words left Lima's mouth. But Monkin didn't take either of those exits. He did something that nobody in that room was prepared for. He agreed. He validated the entire premise, not because he was conceding anything, but because he was about to flip the entire framing on its head. He said it's awesome. He said it's why they get paid. He said if nobody was talking about it, he wouldn't be getting paid what he gets paid. That response completely disarmed every trap Lima had set. You can't use agreement as ammunition. You can't spin enthusiasm as defensiveness. Monkin walked into that grenade and caught it mid-air. And then he said something that every single reporter in that room needed to hear. He said, the inner workings between the quarterbacks and the coaches are going to mean more than anything said outside of that building. Full stop. That wasn't a diplomatic non-answer. That was a declaration. That was Monkin telling every media member in that room that their opinions, their narratives, their carefully crafted headlines carry exactly zero weight in that facility. The competition will be decided by football, by throws, by reads, by trust built between a quarterback and a coaching staff, not by what's trending on Twitter, not by what Mary Kay Cabot thinks, not by Anthony Lima's loaded questions. The room had no response to that, because there is no response to that. That press conference was not a routine media session. What Todd Monken delivered from that podium was something that Cleveland sports media hasn't experienced in a very long time, a head coach who refuses to be controlled by narrative. Let's break down everything Monken actually said, because each piece of it was deliberate. First, he addressed the noise with appreciation rather than frustration. He compared it to presidential approval ratings, saying that if a sitting president has a 55% approval rating, he's doing incredibly well, which means 45% of the country still disapproves of him, and yet he's still in office, still making decisions, still leading. The opinions of the people who disapprove don't change the outcome, they're just data points. That analogy hits different when you apply it to Shedeur Sanders. The Cleveland media doesn't approve of him. Some of them never did. Some of them decided before he walked through the door that he wasn't the right fit. And that's fine. Those opinions exist, but they don't change who takes snaps in practice. They don't change what the scoreboard says on Sunday. They are, to borrow Monkin's framing, just noise. Second, Monkin made the most important statement of the entire press conference. He said it directly, almost like he was delivering a verdict. He said, if outside noise is going to shake you, you have no business being the quarterback of the Cleveland Browns. Now let's be very clear about what that means. That statement is not a warning to Shedeur Sanders. That statement is a declaration of confidence in Shedeur Sanders. Monkin is saying that the kind of pressure Shedeur has been subjected to, the media scrutiny, the unfair evaluation, the headlines designed to undermine him, would break a lesser person. And the fact that it hasn't, the fact that Shedeur Sanders is still walking into that facility every day and putting in the work, is proof that he is built for exactly this.
Monkin didn't say Shedeur needs to get tougher. He said Shedeur already is tough enough. There's a massive difference. Third, Monkin issued a challenge that was aimed directly at the media without mentioning a single reporter by name. He said the only way to stop a narrative is to play well. The only way to destroy a narrative is to win. That's surgical, because what he's really saying is this: every hit piece, every loaded question, every story designed to make Shedeur Sanders look like a liability instead of an asset, all of it becomes irrelevant the moment he starts winning football games. The media built a wall of noise around this kid. Monkin just handed Shedeur a sledgehammer and told him the way through that wall is on the field. And the final piece, the part that most people glossed over, was when Monkin talked about protecting his players from distractions, including distractions that might come from family members making public comments. That was a quiet but unmistakable line drawn in the sand. Monkin was not policing the Sanders family. He was not criticizing Shiloh. He was creating a protective barrier around his quarterback and telling the world, you do not have access to what happens inside this building. Nothing gets through me first. That is what a coach who believes in his player looks like. That is what a coach who is committed to giving a young man a genuine opportunity actually sounds like. There's a difference between a reporter who asks hard questions and a reporter who has an agenda. Hard questions are valuable. They create accountability. They push coaches and players to be honest. They serve the fan base. But an agenda is something else entirely. An agenda means the conclusion is already written, and every story is just another thread being pulled in the same direction. Mary Kay Cabot has been one of the most prominent voices covering the Cleveland Browns for a long time. She's built a career on knowing this organization from the inside. She has access, she has sources, she has reach, and for those reasons, what she chooses to amplify, what stories she chooses to pursue, what angles she chooses to lead with, all of it carries enormous weight in shaping how the public perceives this team. And when you look at her coverage of Shedeur Sanders, the pattern is impossible to explain away with editorial coincidence. Every story seems to land at the worst possible moment for Shedeur. When he's trying to build momentum, something drops to undercut it. When there's an opportunity to highlight his growth or his work ethic, the angle shifts to something negative. When the quarterback competition should be the central story, something adjacent to Shedeur Sanders' name gets elevated into the main headline. It's not one story, it's not two stories. It is a consistent, sustained pattern of coverage that always seems to find its way back to the same destination: Shedeur Sanders as a problem, as a distraction, as someone who doesn't quite fit. And here's what makes it so effective as a media strategy. None of it has to be explicitly false. You can frame a true story in a way that creates a completely misleading impression. You can use accurate quotes in a way that strips them of all context. You can choose which facts to include and which to leave out, and produce a narrative that feels like journalism, but functions like a campaign. The Shedeur Sanders social media story is a perfect example. Was the comment real? Yes. Did some people find it offensive? Apparently. Is it genuinely newsworthy in the context of an NFL quarterback competition? Absolutely not. But that didn't stop it from being treated as a franchise-level crisis, because the goal wasn't to inform the public. The goal was to attach another layer of controversy to the Sanders name at a moment when that name needed to be associated with football, with talent, with opportunity. What makes it even more frustrating is the selective outrage. The same outlets that went ballistic over Shiloh's social media comment were completely silent on questions that actually mattered. Questions about whether Shedeur was getting fair evaluation reps in practice. Questions about whether the system he was being asked to run was designed to make him succeed or set him up to struggle.
questions about the organizational philosophy around developing young quarterbacks. None of those questions made headlines. None of those questions drove clicks, because those questions might have revealed something that didn't fit the predetermined story. When the media decides which questions are worth asking, they also decide which truths are worth knowing. And in Cleveland, for a very specific window of time, the truth about what was being done to Shedeur Sanders wasn't a story anyone in the mainstream press seemed interested in telling. This is the part of the story that almost never gets discussed directly, because discussing it requires admitting that what happened to Shedeur Sanders under the previous regime wasn't a coincidence. It requires looking at a pattern of decisions and asking a very uncomfortable question: was this deliberate? Kevin Stefansky was the head coach of the Cleveland Browns before Todd Monken, and by all accounts, he's a respected football mind. Monkin himself acknowledged that at the press conference, offering genuine praise for Stefansky's coaching ability. You don't become an NFL head coach without earning it. The craft is real. But the decisions Stefansky made regarding Shedeur Sanders paint a picture that's very hard to look away from. Every starting quarterback needs practice reps. This isn't controversial. It isn't even a nuanced football argument. Reps are how a quarterback builds timing with his receivers. Reps are how a quarterback learns to feel the rhythm of an offense. Reps are how a young passer develops the instincts that turn potential into production. This is Football 101. Shedeur Sanders, reports suggest, was denied crucial practice reps during critical evaluation windows under the Stefansky regime. While a quarterback competition was supposedly underway, the distribution of reps, the most basic and fundamental tool a coaching staff has to develop talent, was tilted away from Shedeur at moments that mattered most. Dylan Gabriel appeared to be the favored option. Decision after decision, movement on the depth chart, investment in development, all of it seemed to flow in a direction that was not toward the most gifted passer on that roster. And each time Shedeur was denied an opportunity to build chemistry, to find his rhythm, to look competent in an offense that was supposedly built for everyone, it created the impression that he was struggling, that he wasn't ready, that the critics were right. But here's the thing. A quarterback can only be as good as the system allows him to be, and the system around Shedeur Sanders during that period appeared to be specifically constructed to make sure that no matter what Shedeur did, the conditions made success nearly impossible. The offensive line was a disaster, constant breakdowns, consistent pressure. A quarterback who can't stand in the pocket and go through his reads can't evaluate himself, let alone be evaluated by anyone else fairly. Was that mismanagement? Was that a roster construction failure? Or was it something more intentional, a controlled environment designed to ensure that no matter what Shedeur did, the conditions made success nearly impossible? The offensive resource corps wasn't helping either. Reports suggest that Jerry Jeudy, a genuinely talented wide receiver, was running routes that weren't connecting, dropping balls in crucial moments, and disappearing at the times when Shedeur needed him most. Again, was that coincidence? Was that a personnel problem that nobody in that building seemed motivated to fix? Or was it part of a larger picture where every piece of the puzzle around Shedeur Sanders was subtly, quietly wrong? None of these things individually would be enough to raise alarms. An offensive line can struggle for a lot of reasons. A receiver can have a bad stretch. Practice reps get distributed unevenly for all kinds of reasons. Football is complicated. But when all of these things happen simultaneously, and when they happen specifically around the one quarterback who was already being targeted by media coverage designed to make him look like a liability, the pattern becomes very hard to dismiss as random. That's not coaching. If the rumors and reporting are accurate, that's something else entirely. That's the kind of environment where a young quarterback is set up to fail by the very people who are supposed to be building him up. And then, those same people, or at least the media operation they appeared to have been connected to, wonder out loud why Shedeur hasn't performed up to expectations. Here's what makes the situation truly alarming. Stefansky was fired. The Browns moved on.
Todd Monken came in with a completely different philosophy and, from everything we've seen, a genuine commitment to evaluating Shedeur Sanders honestly and developing him properly. The regime changed, the coaching staff changed, the approach changed, but Mary Kay Cabot is still in those press conferences. Anthony Lima is still asking those questions. The media operation that seemed designed to cast doubt on Shedeur Sanders didn't get fired when Stefansky did. It just kept running. That is not something that can be explained by saying reporters are just doing their jobs. Individual editorial decisions happen all the time. Individual biases exist in every newsroom. But what's being described here isn't a single reporter's preference or one outlet's perspective. It's a sustained, consistent pattern of coverage that survived an entire regime change and continues to function in exactly the same way with exactly the same target. Think about that for a moment. The head coach who allegedly created conditions unfavorable to Shedeur is gone. The offensive coordinator who called the plays is gone. The front office dynamics have shifted. The entire organizational philosophy is supposedly different, and yet the media narrative around Shedeur Sanders hasn't changed at all. That tells you the narrative isn't coming from inside the building anymore. The narrative is self-sustaining. It has its own momentum. It has its own infrastructure. It has reporters who have already decided what the story is and who Shedeur Sanders is, and no amount of coaching staff turnover is going to change that.
No other quarterback in that building is being covered this way. No other player in the AFC North is getting this level of sustained, targeted skepticism from their own city's press corps. The scrutiny is not proportionate to the situation. The negativity is not balanced by any genuine attempt to present the other side, to show what Shedeur is doing right, what he's improved, where his talent is undeniable. Because presenting that side doesn't serve the narrative, and the narrative is what this has always been about. Monkin clearly understands this. His response at that press conference wasn't just a defense of his quarterback, it was an acknowledgement that he's fully aware of the environment his player has been dropped into, and he's not going to pretend it's normal or fair. He's drawing a boundary. He's saying loudly and clearly, the apparatus you've built doesn't work in my building. You don't have access to what happens in here, and no amount of outside pressure is going to change who develops and who plays. That's leadership. Real leadership. The kind that doesn't bend because a reporter with a platform decides to make noise. Let's talk about Shedeur Sanders, the quarterback. Because in all of this noise, all of this manufactured drama, all of these calculated hit pieces and loaded questions, the actual football player has somehow gotten lost in the conversation. Shedeur Sanders is not some legacy case writing his father's name into the NFL. He's a legitimately talented quarterback who came out of one of the most unconventional college environments in recent memory and still managed to produce at an elite level. His anticipation is real. His arm talent is real. His ability to move through progressions and find the right receiver under pressure, all of that is real. The Cleveland media largely chose not to cover that story. They covered the controversies. They covered the family dynamics. They covered the social media comments and the dress choices and the general circus that follows the Sanders name wherever it goes. All of that made for great clicks and great engagement. None of it told you anything about whether Shedeur Sanders could actually play quarterback in the National Football League. That's a choice. Editors make choices about what gets covered and what doesn't. Reporters decide which angles to pursue and which to let go. And in Cleveland, for a sustained period of time, the choice was consistently to cover everything around Shedeur rather than Shedeur himself. Meanwhile, the kid is in that facility every single day. He's watching film, he's running through drills, he's building relationships with the wide receivers and tight ends and offensive linemen who are supposed to be his weapons. He's learning a new offensive system under a coaching staff that for the first time in his NFL career appears to actually want him to succeed. None of that gets written about. None of that gets amplified, because a story about a young quarterback working hard and developing under a supportive coaching staff doesn't generate the same kind of engagement as a story about his brother's social media comment. That's the fundamental dishonesty at the heart of what's been happening in Cleveland. The media didn't cover Shedeur Sanders, they covered a caricature of Shedeur Sanders, the celebrity son, the controversy magnet, the walking distraction. And then, when the caricature was met with skepticism by fans and analysts, they pointed to that skepticism as evidence that the caricature was accurate. It's circular, it's self-fulfilling, and it's been devastating for a young man who deserves to be evaluated on his actual football ability. Todd Monken appears to be the first person in a position of authority in that building who is publicly insisting on a different standard. He's insisting that Shedeur Sanders be evaluated on what happens inside that facility, not on what trends on social media. He's insisting that the competition be decided by throws and reads and chemistry and preparation, not by media approval ratings. That's not a radical position. It's the only position that makes any sense if you actually want to win football games. But apparently, in Cleveland, it needed to be said out loud from a podium in front of cameras before anyone took it seriously. Here's where things get really interesting. Because what Todd Monken did at that press conference wasn't just a defense of Shedeur Sanders, it was a public redrawing of the power map inside the Cleveland Browns organization. For a long time, and especially during the Stefansky era, there was an implicit understanding about how things worked. The media covered the team responded to the media's questions, the narratives shaped public perception influenced organizational decisions. It was a feedback loop, and certain reporters had figured out how to position themselves inside that loop in a way that gave them enormous informal power over how players were perceived and how decisions were made. Monkin just blew that loop up.
He stood at that podium and made it absolutely clear that the Cleveland sports media does not have a seat at the table where decisions about this football team are made. They don't get a vote on the depth chart. Their narratives don't influence who gets reps in practice. Their approval or disapproval of any player, any coaching decision, any organizational move, it's just data. It's just noise in the background. It doesn't move the needle. That's a massive shift, and anyone who's been paying attention to the Browns' media dynamic for the past few years understands exactly how significant it is. Monkin also made something else clear with that press conference. He is not afraid of this media. He's not trying to manage them, he's not trying to placate them, he's not courting their approval or angling for favorable coverage. He came in there, answered the questions the way he wanted to answer them, made his points clearly and confidently, and walked away having completely dismantled the narrative that Lima was trying to build without ever losing his composure or saying anything that could be twisted against him. That's a level of media sophistication that this franchise has not seen in a long time, and it matters enormously for Shedeur Sanders' development. Because when a head coach is afraid of the media, that fear trickles down. Players feel it, coordinators feel it, the entire organizational culture gets shaped around managing perceptions rather than developing talent. When a head coach doesn't care about the media, when he's genuinely, authentically focused only on what happens inside that building, that confidence is also contagious. Shedeur Sanders now knows that his head coach has his back, not in a sentimental way, not in a motivational poster kind of way, in a very practical, concrete, publicly declared way. Monkin stood at that podium in front of cameras and said to everyone watching, this quarterback is built for this pressure, and what happens inside this building is the only thing that matters. That's armor. That's real protection from a media environment that has been trying to tear this kid down since before he took his first NFL snap. Let's zoom out for a second, because this isn't just a story about media bias or one press conference or even the development of one quarterback. This is a story about what kind of franchise the Cleveland Browns are going to be. Cleveland has one of the most tortured quarterback histories in the entire NFL. The list of quarterbacks who came through that city with promise and left with their confidence shattered is genuinely staggering. Some of those failures were about talent, some of them were about supporting cast, but a significant number of them were also about organizational dysfunction, about environments where a quarterback could never truly trust that the people around him were invested in his success.
Shedeur Sanders walked into that version of Cleveland. He came in and found a media that was already hostile, a coaching staff that, according to multiple reports and a pattern of decisions, appeared to be less than fully committed to developing him, and a public environment where his family name was more often treated as a liability than an asset. That's not a winning environment. That's a recipe for wasting another quarterback in a city that cannot afford to waste another quarterback. Todd Monken appears to understand this. His entire approach to this situation, the press conference response, the philosophy he's outlined about what determines success, the boundary he's drawn between what happens inside the facility and what happens outside, all of it suggests a coach who is determined to not let this franchise repeat the same mistake it's been making for decades. The media can write whatever they want. Mary Kay Cabot can file another story. Anthony Lima can ask another loaded question. The social media accounts can generate another viral controversy. None of it gets through that coaching staff to affect what Shedeur Sanders does in practice tomorrow morning. That might sound simple, it might even sound obvious, but for the Cleveland Browns, for this quarterback in this specific moment, it's revolutionary. Monkin isn't just coaching football, he's coaching against an entire culture of dysfunction that has surrounded this franchise for years. He's dismantling one practice rep and one press conference at a time, the apparatus that was specifically designed to make sure Shedeur Sanders never got a fair shot. And Shedeur, for his part, is showing up every day. Through the noise, through the unfair coverage, through the hostile questions and the manufactured controversies and the constant background hum of a media operation that wants him to fail, he's showing up and doing the work. That's character, that's resilience, that's exactly what you want in a franchise quarterback. At the end of everything, all the analysis, all the media breakdowns, all the organizational theory, football comes back to one thing: what happens on the field. Monkin said it as clearly as it can possibly be said. You want to stop a narrative? Play well. You want to destroy a narrative? Win. That's where this story ultimately has to go. Because no amount of media exposure, no amount of coaching defense, no amount of dissection of press conference exchanges actually matters in the final accounting. The scoreboard is the only reporter that can't be influenced by an agenda. The box score doesn't have a bias. The standings don't care about Twitter.
If Shedeur Sanders wins football games, if he stands in that pocket and delivers throws and makes decisions and leads that team to victories, every single story that's been written about him becomes irrelevant. Every loaded question, every carefully framed piece of negative coverage, every attempt to attach controversy to his name instead of touchdowns, all of it gets erased by wins. And here's what the Cleveland media seems to have forgotten in all of their positioning in narrative building. They need a story. If Shedeur Sanders becomes a winning quarterback, their story becomes incredibly simple. A talented young quarterback overcame an unfair evaluation process, got a real opportunity under a committed coaching staff, and turned the Cleveland Browns into a legitimate contender. That's a great story. But it's not the story they've been trying to tell. And that's what makes Monkin's intervention so significant. He's not just protecting his quarterback in the present moment, he's setting the stage for a different kind of story to be written. One that's told in wins and losses rather than Twitter controversies and press conference drama. The machine that was built to undermine Shedeur Sanders is still running. Mary Kay Cabot is still in those press rooms. Anthony Lima is still asking his questions. The apparatus is still there, looking for angles, looking for ways to keep the negative narrative alive. But something has changed, something fundamental. There's now a head coach in that building who has publicly declared that the inner workings between coaches and quarterbacks matter more than anything said outside that building. He said outside noise doesn't belong in the psyche of a starting quarterback. He said the only way to kill a narrative is to win on the field. And he said it all with the quiet confidence of a man who has already made up his mind about who his quarterback is and what he's capable of. The Cleveland media will keep doing what they do. The questions will keep coming. The headlines will keep landing. That's the business they're in, and it doesn't change overnight just because a head coach delivered a brilliant press conference response. But something is shifted. Inside that facility, behind closed doors, in the film rooms and practice fields where careers are actually built, something is genuinely different now. There's a coaching staff that wants Shedeur to succeed. There's a quarterback who has shown through everything that's been thrown at him that he's built for exactly this kind of pressure. And if Monkin's instincts are right, if the football does the talking the way he believes it will, the story being written about Shedeur Sanders a year from now might look nothing like the one Cleveland's media has been trying to write. Because in the end, the scoreboard doesn't care about narratives, and that's the only headline that actually matters.